My millionaire ex-husband invited me to his lavish wedding just to humiliate me, completely convinced I was a broke, struggling single mother. He even had me seated behind a giant pillar so my $45 dress wouldn't ruin his photos. But the exact moment a highly decorated four-star general stood at rigid attention and delivered a booming formal salute straight to my face, all the color drained from his eyes. Suddenly, every smartphone in the ballroom lit up with a truth that shattered his multi-million-dollar empire of lies. He thought he had won the divorce, but he was about to discover that the woman he looked down on was someone he could never command. Today's story is a powerful reminder that your human value never depends on someone else's superficial approval. If you are ready to claim your true worth, hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to join our fleet of resilience. Let's begin. The saltwater breeze from the Atlantic always carried a particular clarity, the kind that swept away decades of complex naval bureaucratic fog and left only the raw, unfiltered truth of the present moment. I sat on the weathered wooden porch of my small coastal cottage in Maine, watching the early June fog roll lazily over the dark gray waves, a half-read historical biography resting on my lap. For 38 years, my life had been measured by the rigid tick of military clocks, the relentless pressure of tactical logistics, and the heavy burden of overseeing thousands of sailors as a three-star vice admiral in the United States Navy. Retirement, which had felt like a terrifyingly empty horizon when I first stepped off the command ship, had slowly transformed into a sanctuary of deep, profound peace. I had learned to love the quiet afternoons where my only immediate operational objective was choosing which blend of herbal tea to steep. My peaceful isolation was gently broken by the heavy, familiar thud of work boots marching across the gravel driveway. It was Arthur, my 72-year-old neighbor, and a fiercely proud retired Coast Guard veteran, carrying a small stack of envelopes he had retrieved from the main road. Arthur possessed an internal radar for neighborhood drama that rivaled the most advanced sonar systems I had ever commanded. And today, his weathered face was locked in an expression of intense, joyful suspicion. He stopped at the edge of the porch, sorting through the plain white utility bills before holding up a thick, oversized square envelope that practically screamed ostentation. It was crafted from heavy, cream-colored cotton paper, sealed with a meticulous dollop of gold wax, and featured elegant, looping calligraphy that shone like polished brass in the afternoon light. "You got something real fancy in the grid today, Vicky," Arthur said, his gravelly voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper as he handed it to me. "Feels like the paper alone costs more than the alignment on my old pickup truck. Who's flashing that kind of cash at a retired sailor?" The moment my eyes locked onto the elegant embossed return address on the back of the heavy wax seal, a sudden genuine laugh escaped my lips. Julian Vance, my ex-husband. The sheer, predictable vanity of the presentation was so uniquely his that it felt as though 20 years of separation had evaporated in a single heartbeat. Arthur watched my face intently, his gray eyebrows knitting together as he noticed the sharp twist of amusement in my smile. He pulled up a faded wooden chair, uninvited but entirely welcome, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "That bad, huh?" Arthur asked, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Worse," I replied, breaking the expensive gold wax seal with my thumb without an ounce of reverence. "It's a performance." Inside the envelope sat an incredibly elaborate wedding invitation, printed on layered cardstock that detailed the upcoming nuptials of Julian Vance to Chloe Montgomery, a 24-year-old heiress to one of the largest commercial real estate empires in New England. The ceremony was scheduled to take place at the ultra-exclusive Crown Jewels Resort in Martha's Vineyard, a playground for old money and corporate dynasties. I wasn't surprised in the slightest. Julian had spent his entire adult existence chasing two specific metrics: unearned public adoration and maximum financial leverage. However, what truly caught my attention wasn't the formal invitation itself. It was a small, heavy piece of matching cream paper tucked inside the silk lining, bearing a handwritten message in Julian-esque familiar, aggressive cursive. "Victoria, I know it's been decades since our path diverged. I truly hope life has been gentle on your limited civilian resources. Perhaps attending this celebration will give you a rare glimpse of what true, modern success looks like these days. Best, Julian." Arthur leaned over, his eyes scanning the handwritten lines before letting out a low, Appreciative whistle of disbelief. Wow, that is a highly calibrated, deeply targeted piece of malice right there. The man still thinks he's running a psychological operation against you. Ooh, it's classic, Julian, I said, setting the note down on the small table between us. 20 years have passed since our divorce papers were signed. And somehow, in the quiet corners of his mind, he still believes he is locked in a competition that he needs to win. When our marriage collapsed 2 decades ago, I was a young, intensely driven Navy captain. I worked grueling 18-hour days, moved from base to base at the whim of the Pentagon, deployed to hostile waters for months at a time, and owned exactly 3 sets of civilian clothes that weren't standard issue or functional. Julian, who was busy building his commercial construction firm into a regional powerhouse, spent our entire marriage reminding me that my dedication to the country was nothing more than a poor man's hobby compared to his climbing tax brackets. To Julian, my salary was a joke. My uniform was an inconvenience, and my ambition was a threat to his ego. Over the subsequent decades, our sparse communication had been strictly restricted to brief, clinical logistics regarding our daughter, Cynthia. He never bothered to ask about my career progression, and I never volunteered the information. When I was promoted to Rear Admiral, he didn't care to know. When I earned my second star, he was too busy profiling his corporate net worth to notice. He had written a very comfortable story about me in his head. I was the struggling, abandoned ex-wife who had faded into administrative obscurity. Arthur leaned back, tapping his fingers against his chin. So, what is the strategic play? Admiral, you going to ignore this garbage and drop it in the fireplace? I looked down at the gold lettering, then out at the gray main tide. Curious. Quiet question began to form in the back of my mind. How do people truly treat another human being when they are entirely convinced that person has absolutely nothing of value to offer them? No, I whispered, a slow, calculated smile spreading across my face as the plan crystallized. I'm going to go to Martha's Vineyard, and I am going to give Julian exactly the version of me he desperately needs to see. The transformation required a deliberate, tactical stripping away of 40 years of accumulated authority, 1 week before the wedding. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, analyzing my reflection with the same clinical objectivity I used to evaluate fleet readiness reports. At 62, my posture was still undeniably straight, a physical habit carved into my spine by decades of standing on moving naval decks. My hair was a sharp, clean silver, and my eyes carried the steady, calm confidence that only comes from years of directing high-stakes global operations. The problem was that exact confidence. True authority gives itself away in the quietest movements. I wasn't trying to look important for this trip. I was trying to look entirely ordinary. The kind of woman who blended seamlessly into the background of a crowded grocery store line. I opened my closet and deliberately ignored the tailored Italian wool jackets, the elegant silk dinner dresses, and the pristine white formal uniforms that had defined my public life at international summits and Pentagon galas. Instead, I drove to a local department store and purchased a plain, unbranded navy blue polyester dress for $45. It was modest, slightly loose, and decidedly old-fashioned. I paired it with a set of sensible, low-heeled black comfort shoes designed for standing all day, an unbranded canvas tote bag, and absolutely no jewelry except for my mother's faded silver wedding band. When I finished putting the ensemble together and looked back at the mirror, the vice admiral had vanished. In her place stood a tired, unassuming woman who looked less like a retired military leader and more like a forgotten high school secretary, scraping by on a minimal pension. It was the perfect operational camouflage. The journey to Martha's Vineyard was a study in social stratification. Rather than utilizing the standard military transport options or professional car services that my retired rank still occasionally afforded me for high-profile regional travel, I chose to drive my 12-year-old Ford Escape. The SUV had a rusted rear bumper, a slight rattle in the exhaust, and a permanent layer of Maine sea salt coating the doors. As I drove onto the ferry and eventually navigated the winding, manicured roads of the island, the visual contrast became stark. The roads were populated by pristine luxury sports cars and immaculate SUVs driven by individuals wearing crisp linen and designer sunglasses. When I finally pulled into the long, cobblestone driveway of the Crown Jewel Resort, the structural hierarchy of the civilian world revealed itself in an instant. The grand entrance was flanked by towering flower arrangements and massive crystal chandeliers that visible even through the glass doors of the lobby. A young valet attendant in a tailored uniform was enthusiastically greeting a gentleman stepping out of a brand new Bentley. When it was my turn to pull forward, the attendant's bright, professional smile noticeably froze. He took a long, assessing look at my rusted Ford Escape, scanned my cheap dress and bare wrists, and his professional enthusiasm completely vanished into thin air. "Reservation name?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional, yet entirely stripped of the deferential warmth he had just showered upon the previous guest. "Victoria Harrison. I'm a guest on the Vance list," I replied gently, keeping my hands resting quietly on the worn steering wheel. He didn't make eye contact as he handed me a basic plastic parking ticket. "Right. Park around the back in the overflow lot, ma'am. The main driveway and front spaces are reserved strictly for VIP vehicles and luxury models today." "Thank you so much," I said softly, navigating the vehicle exactly where he directed without a hint of complaint. I felt an odd, exhilarating sense of relaxation. When you consciously step outside the cage of trying to impress people, the world becomes a transparent laboratory of human behavior. Inside the marble lobby, the social profiling intensified. As I walked toward the grand ballroom wing, carrying my canvas tote bag, a young wedding coordinator equipped with a frantic expression, clipboard, and a wireless headset came rushing directly toward me. She didn't ask for my identification or my invitation. She took one look at my lack of cosmetics and my department store shoes and pointed a manicured finger toward a narrow side corridor. "Oh, sweetie, the vendor and catering staff check-in is down that hallway to the left," she said quickly, her voice hushed as if trying to clear a blemish from the main floor. The service double doors lead straight to the kitchen. I stopped walking and looked at her with an expression of innocent confusion. "Oh, I'm actually a registered wedding guest. I'm on the groom's family list." The poor girl's face turned an instantaneous, vibrant shade of crimson. She frantically tapped on her tablet, scrolling past the high-profile names until she found my entry hidden deep within the secondary rows. "I am so incredibly sorry, Miss Harrison. I just assumed, given the arrival timeline." "Please forgive me." "It is entirely fine," I said, offering her a reassuring smile before continuing on my way. And it truly was fine. She wasn't an inherently cruel person. She was simply a product of an environment that had systematically trained her to see labels, price tags, and exterior packaging instead of human beings. One old vehicle, one cheap dress, and a lack of visible currency had automatically reclassified my presence into a lower tier of human value. It was an invaluable piece of intelligence. As I approached the double doors of the welcome cocktail lounge, I adjusted the strap of my canvas bag, took a deep breath, and prepared to step directly into the heart of my ex-husband's carefully constructed illusion. The pre-wedding dinner area was a sprawling, glass-walled terrace that felt less like a celebration of love and more like a high-stakes corporate networking gala. Women draped in diamonds and designer silk stood in tight circles, while men in bespoke tuxedos loudly debated the shifting landscape of commercial interest rates and New England zoning laws. I stood quietly near a towering floral arrangement of white orchids, holding a plain glass of unsweetened iced tea, watching the entire spectacle unfold. It was a masterclass in social posturing. Julian moved through the crowd like a political candidate, clapping investors on the back, laughing a bit too loudly at their jokes, and ensuring everyone within a 50-foot radius knew the exact cost per square foot of his latest high-rise development in Boston. He was entirely in his element, feeding his insatiable hunger for validation. It didn't take long for his sharp, scanning eyes to lock onto me from across the room. I watched the split-second calculation happen behind his eyes. First, a flash of irritation that his impoverished ex-wife was actually occupying space in his pristine environment, followed immediately by a look of profound, smug satisfaction. He whispered something to Chloe, his young bride. The two of them began marching toward my corner, their posture dripping with a mixture of arrogance and performative benevolence. Chloe was undeniably stunning in a polished, magazine cover sort of way, but her expression carried the distinct, cold trice of old money that had never known a day of actual struggle. "Victoria, you actually made it out of the woods," Julian said, his voice laced with an aggressive undertone of pity as he stepped into my personal space. "I was starting to worry your old Ford wouldn't survive the ferry ride over." "This is Chloe." Chloe extended a perfectly manicured hand, her heavy diamond engagement ring catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. It's a genuine pleasure to finally meet you, Victoria. Julian has shared so much about your difficult years after the split. It must be incredibly overwhelming for you to be surrounded by all of this elegance. I am managing to find it quite illuminating, Chloe, I replied, keeping my hands folded loosely over my $45 navy dress. My posture deliberately relaxed. Chloe leaned in slightly closer, dropping her voice into a hushed tone that was clearly intended for the wealthy couples socializing nearby. Listen, Victoria, Julian and I believe that those of us who have been blessed with immense modern success have a moral obligation to give back to those who haven't. We know that military pensions can be incredibly restrictive, and we don't want your pride to stand in the way of your comfort. She reached into her designer clutch, pulled out a beautifully crisp, signed family foundation check, and held it out to me. This is a $5,000 charity grant from our personal account. Please use it for your medical bills, your housing, or whatever else you need to get by. Consider it a gift from the family. I looked down at the paper check resting between her fingers. It was a calculated piece of social degradation, delivered under the guise of sweet charity to ensure I knew my place at the bottom of their hierarchy. Before I could speak, Julian added a patronizing chuckle. Take it, Vicky. We just want to make sure you're taken care of, even if you didn't achieve much in life. Instead of reacting with the anger they so desperately desire to validate their superiority, I simply smiled, reached into my canvas tote, and slipped the check inside. That is an extraordinarily revealing gesture, Chloe. Thank you! They walked away, completely satisfied that they had reduced me to a charity case. As they vanished back into the sea of silk, my daughter Cynthia stepped out from behind a marble pillar, her face flushed with absolute fury. I can't take this anymore. Mom, she whispered, her fists clenched tight. You are a decorated vice admiral who has commanded international fleets and directed humanitarian operations that saved thousands of lives. Why are you letting them treat you like a beggar? I placed a gentle, calming hand on her arm. Because, Cynthia, people will always reveal exactly who they are when they think there are no consequences. Let them play their game. The truth is patient. And it doesn't need to scream to be absolute. The day of the main ceremony arrived with a crisp, clear sky over Martha's Vineyard. But inside the grand ballroom of the Crown Jewel Resort, the atmosphere was thick with corporate vanity. Julian S. seating chart had placed me precisely in row 12, tucked directly behind a massive floral arrangement, so that my plain navy dress wouldn't disrupt the aesthetic of the professional photographers filming the front rows. I sat there quietly, watching the 200 elite guests fill the room. The string quartet played a soft, classical melody as Julian stood at the altar, adjusting his Tom Ford tuxedo, looking like a man who believed he owned the world. At exactly 12:58 p.m., the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. Walking into the room was a tall, imposing figure whose presence immediately commanded the attention of everyone nearby. It was General Thomas Vance, Julian S. estranged uncle, and a highly respected four-star Marine commander who had avoided Julian for years due to his unethical business practices. Julian had invited him solely to use his name on the guest list for social capital, never expecting the legendary general to actually attend. Julian S.'s face immediately lit up with predatory joy at the altar. He thought his uncle had come to honor his real estate empire. But General Vance didn't look toward the altar. His sharp, disciplined eyes swept across the ballroom, bypassing the billionaires and politicians, until his gaze locked onto row 12, onto me, without a glance at his nephew. The general marched directly down the center aisle, his heavy dress boots echoing sharply over the classical music. The string quartet faltered and stopped playing as the entire room grew dead silent. Julian called out from the altar, "Uncle Thomas, you made it to the head table." General Vance ignored him completely. He stopped right at my row, turned his entire body squarely toward my cheap department store dress, stood at rigid attention, and brought his right hand up to his brow in a flawless, formal military salute. "Good afternoon, Vice Admiral Harrison." The General S. voice boomed, echoing off the high crystal ceilings. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing before anyone could utter a syllable. 3 other retired naval officers who were staying at the resort for a separate defense conference stood up instantly from their front row seats, turned toward me, and snapped into matching salutes. I stood up calmly from behind the floral pillar that was meant to hide me. I brought my hand up, returning the salute with the effortless grace of a woman who had spent 38 years commanding fleets. Good afternoon, General, at ease. The moment my hand came down, whispers exploded through the room like a wave. Guests frantically pulled out their smartphones, typing my name into naval registries and official government databases. Within seconds, my official White House decoration photograph showing me in my white dress uniform, shoulder board shining with 3 silver stars alongside the president, was being passed from screen to screen. The impoverished single mother had suddenly transformed into one of the highest ranking military leaders in the United States Navy. Julian stepped down from the altar, his face completely drained of color, his hands shaking violently as his entire reality shattered. Uncle Thomas, what is this? This is Victoria. She is just a broke retiree. General Vance turned a ice cold glare onto his nephew. Shut your mouth, Julian. You are speaking to a decorated servant of this nation who has managed logistics and lives on a global scale while you were busy manipulating property lines. You wanted this room to see what success looks like. Take a good look at Vice Admiral Harrison, because none of your bank accounts will ever match the legacy of the woman you failed to respect. Chloe stood beside him, her face completely pale, staring at me as if she had seen a ghost. The $5,000 charity check she had handed me the night before felt like a burning weight between us. I walked out into the center aisle, completely poised, looking at the two of them with no anger, only a profound sense of calm dignity. Julian, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. The tragedy today isn't that you didn't know my rank. The tragedy is that you believe anyone who wears a $45 dress deserves to be treated with condescension. True success isn't about looking down from a high tower. It says about how many people you lifted up along the way. I pulled the check from my bag, placed it gently back into Chloe's trembling hand, and walked toward the exit as the entire ballroom stood up to applaud. The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom closed behind me, cutting off the immediate hum of frantic whispers and the rhythmic clapping that had followed me out. The long, sunlit gallery corridor of the Crown Jewels Resort felt blissfully empty, a stark contrast to the thick, suffocating atmosphere of social posturing I had just left behind. I walked slowly toward the glass-enclosed terrace overlooking the Atlantic, my sensible department store shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floors. The high-stakes adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation faded, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. I leaned against the stone balustrade, breathing in the sharp, salty air of Martha's Vineyard, watching a lone sailboat navigate the choppy gray waters in the distance. For decades, I had navigated international crises and high-pressure military deployments, yet witnessing the sudden, public collapse of a human being's entire identity was always an unsettling sight to behold. Within 10 minutes, the heavy glass doors to the terrace creaked open, and the uneven sound of hesitant footsteps approached. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. 20 years of shared history had made Julian's physical presence instantly recognizable. When he stepped up to the balustrade beside me, he didn't look like the confident, untouchable real estate tycoon who had spent the weekend boasting about his profit margins. He looked visibly aged, the sharp lines around his jaw sagging, his shoulders hunched inside his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, as if he were suddenly carrying an unbearable weight. We stood in silence for several long moments, our eyes fixed on the horizon where the ocean met the pale sky, the absolute quiet between us stretching until it became heavy with unspoken regret. I don't even know where to begin. Victoria, Julian finally whispered, his voice cracking slightly, completely stripped of the booming, arrogant cadence he had used to dominate conversations the night before. He ran a trembling hand through his thinning hair, looking down at his polished leather shoes. A 3-star admiral, Vice Admiral of the United States Navy, my God. All those years, all those promotions. And I spent every single conversation assuming you were barely scraping by on an administrative clerk's pension. I turned my head slightly, looking at his profile with a calm, steady gaze. Would it have truly mattered if you knew? Julian, if I had told you about the stars on my shoulders, would you have respected me for who I am? Or would you have simply respected the power of the uniform? For 20 years, you never cared enough to ask about my life, my challenges, or my sacrifices. You only cared about what you could measure with a dollar sign. The question hit him with the force of a physical blow, and he flinched, looking away as a deep flush of shame crept up his neck. I honestly thought things had been devastating for you after the divorce, he admitted, his voice dropping into a raw, painful whisper that contained no defensive posturing. I built the corporation. I made the millions. I bought the mansions. And I convinced myself that because I was accumulating wealth, it meant I had won our split. I needed to believe you were failing so I could feel secure in my own choices. Life is never that simple. Julian, I said softly, reaching out to place a gentle hand near his arm. Though I didn't touch him, my promotions didn't erase the hardships. I spent years deployed away from Cynthia, missing her birthdays, missing milestones, losing close friends in operations, and working 18-hour days under immense pressure. Being successful in my career didn't mean my life was an easy ride, just as making millions didn't make your life perfect. But you were so consumed by the illusion of winning a competition that you forgot to look at the human cost of the journey. Julian let out a quiet, hollow laugh, a sound of genuine realization that seemed to clear away years of defensive vanity. I never thought about any of that. I was so blind, Victoria. I should have respected your dedication. I should have told Cynthia how incredibly proud she should be of her mother, instead of letting her think you were pushed aside. I failed completely as a father in those moments. And I failed to see the woman you actually became. Before I could respond to his confession, the terrace door opened once more, and Chloe stepped out onto the stone tiles. The young heiress looked completely transformed. The rigid, patronizing confidence that had defined her interactions the previous evening had vanished, replaced by a visible, trembling vulnerability. She folded her arms tightly across her expensive bridal gown, her eyes red and moist as she looked between Julian and me. Julian gave me a long, exhausted look, quietly excused himself, and walked back into the resort, leaving the two of us alone under the fading afternoon sun. Chloe took a deep, shaky breath, walked slowly to the balustrade, and looked at me with an expression of profound embarrassment. I am so deeply ashamed of how I treated you. Vice Admiral Harrison, Chloe said, her voice trembling as she struggled to maintain her composure. I owe you the most sincere apology. When we met yesterday, you made massive, arrogant assumptions about your life, your worth, your finances based entirely on your appearance. There is absolutely no excuse for the way I tried to hand you that charity check to make myself feel superior. I offered her a gentle, compassionate smile, my posture entirely relaxed. Most people at the wedding made those exact same assumptions. Chloe, you were simply the only one brave enough to act on what you believed was true. You thought you were being a benevolent savior, but your arrogance blinded you to the reality of the person standing right in front of you. That doesn't make it any better, Chloe whispered, a tear finally escaping and running down her pale cheek. Julian had talked about you over the years, and he made it sound like you never recovered after the marriage ended. I believed him blindly because it fit into the comfortable narrative of our social circle. I treated one of the highest-ranking women in the military like an impoverished beggar who needed my financial rescue. Can you ever forgive me for my ignorance? The younger version of myself, the fierce Navy captain who had fought through systemic barriers to earn her rank, might have held on to the resentment, but 62 years of life and service had taught me the futility of carrying old wounds. Of course I forgive you, Chloe, I said, reaching across the space to gently touch her hand. Real strength doesn't come from holding on to grudges or celebrating someone else's public humiliation. Real strength comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when the entire world misjudges you. You have a long life ahead with Julian. Just promise me that from this day forward, you will look at people's character, not their price tags. The relief that washed over her face was instantaneous, her shoulders visibly relaxing as she nodded vigorously. By the time evening arrived, the chaotic shock of the afternoon had mostly faded from the resort. Inside the grand ballroom, the orchestra had replaced the string quartet, and the guests had adjusted to the new reality. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, and within a few hours, my true identity had simply become the new baseline of the weekend. I returned to the room, no longer viewed as the struggling ex-wife or the mysterious outsider, but simply as Margaret, a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had lived long enough to understand what actually mattered. 3 weeks later, the true victory of this entire journey manifested not in a grand ballroom or a military base, but in a small, crowded elementary school gymnasium in Maine. Cynthia had invited all of us to attend her daughter Sophie's academic award ceremony. I sat on a cold metal folding chair, dressed in a simple casual sweater, with Julian sitting comfortably on my right and Chloe sitting peacefully on his other side. There was no tension, no corporate posturing, and no toxic competition between us. We chatted politely about the local weather and Sophie's upcoming summer camp when my granddaughter S name was called. She bounced across the wooden stage with pure excitement, clutching her small paper certificate before running straight into my open arms. Grandma, Sophie cheered, burying her face in my shoulder. What's the absolute best thing about being a famous Navy admiral? The adults around us fell silent, smiling as they waited for my response. I looked at Julian, who was watching me with a quiet look of profound respect, and then back at my granddaughter's bright, curious eyes. The absolute best thing. Sophie is learning exactly who you are. People will spend your entire life trying to tell you who you should be based on what you wear or how much money you have. But true, unbreakable strength comes from knowing your own worth, even when nobody else in the room can see it. Your value never depended on their approval in the first place. The rhythmic hum of the school gymnasium faded into a gentle background noise as parents and grandparents began folding up their metal chairs, laughing and congratulating the children. I held Sophia's small hand as we walked toward the exit, her little fingers wrapped tightly around mine, her eyes still bright with the excitement of her achievement. Julian and Chloe followed closely behind us, stepping out into the cool, crisp Maine afternoon air. There were no flashing cameras, no expensive catering staff, and no wealthy investors looking to measure our social worth. It was just a normal family moment. The kind of ordinary reality that Julian had spent the majority of his adult life trying to outrun. As we reached the parking lot, he stepped forward, looking down at Sophie with a soft, genuine smile that I hadn't seen on his face since the very early days of our marriage. You did an incredible job up there. Sweetheart, Julian said, his voice dropping into a gentle cadence as he reached into his pocket and handed Sophie a small, beautifully carved wooden bird he had found at a local artisan shop earlier that morning. A real award for a very smart girl. Your grandmother is right. Knowing who you are is the greatest asset you will ever own. Sophie beamed, taking the toy and running ahead to show her mother, Cynthia, who was waiting by the cars. Julian watched her go, his eyes lingering on his daughter and granddaughter before he turned back to face me. The stark, defensive mask of the high-flying corporate executive had completely melted away, leaving behind a man who finally seemed comfortable in his own skin. Chloe stood quietly by his side, her arm slipped gently through his, no longer looking at the world through the lens of tricked to condescension, but observing with a quiet, respectful curiosity. I spent the last 3 weeks looking over old photographs. Victoria, Julian said, his voice steady but carrying a distinct layer of emotional weight. I found a picture of you from 25 years ago, standing on the deck of a destroyer in the middle of a storm. You look so small against the ocean, yet so completely unshakable. I remembered how I used to mock your long hours, how I called your deployments an inconvenience to my business schedule. I was trying so hard to convince myself that my skyscrapers were more important than your service because I was terrified of how small I actually felt next to your dedication. I leaned against the side of my old Ford Escape, the salt air brushing against my silver hair. We all build defense mechanisms when we are young. Julian, you measured your security with dollar signs and real estate portfolios because that was the only language you knew how to speak. The mistake wasn't building businesses. The mistake was using those businesses as a shield to avoid looking at your own reflection. True success is never a competition with another person, and it's certainly not something you can win in a divorce settlement. Chloe stepped forward slightly, her expression earnest. It's an entirely different way of looking at the world. Victoria, in our social circles, we are taught that if you aren't constantly showcasing your acquisition of wealth, you are becoming invisible. Seeing you stand in that ballroom, completely secure in a $45 dress while 4-star generals saluted you, shattered every rule I was ever taught about status. You didn't need a single label to command that entire room. That is because status is an illusion created by people who are starved for validation, I replied, looking at both of them with deep, unconditional warmth. When you spend 38 years in uniform, responsible for logistics, strategy, and human lives, you quickly realize that the ocean doesn't care about your bank account. A storm treats a billionaire's yacht exactly the same way it treats a fisherman's trawler. True authority, True value comes from the internal anchor you build within yourself. Once you have that anchor, you can stand anywhere, in any clothes, and no one can ever make you feel small. The late afternoon sun began to dip below the pine trees, casting long, golden shadows across the gravel parking lot as we prepared to say our goodbyes. Cynthia was loading Sophie's school projects into the back of her car, her laughter echoing softly across the quiet space. Julian walked over to my driver's side door, his movements slower, more deliberate than they had been during the chaotic weekend in Martha's Vineyard. He stopped, looking at the faded, rusted bumper of my Ford Escape. And for the first time in 20 years, he didn't make a single disparaging comment about its economic value. Instead, he reached out and placed his hand over mine as it rested on the door handle. "Thank you for coming today, Victoria," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an absolute honesty that cleared away the final remnants of our painful past. "And thank you for not letting me stay blind. If you had walked into that wedding in your full dress uniform, with all your medals and your stars shining, I would have just felt attacked. I would have built a bigger wall of arrogance to defend myself. But walking in the way you did, you forced me to confront how I treat people when I think they have nothing. It was the hardest, most humiliating lesson of my life. But it was the one I desperately needed to learn. Life has a beautiful way of balancing the scales if we are patient enough to let it work." "Julian," I said, squeezing his hand gently before releasing it, "the victory was never about making you look foolish. The real victory is sitting here today, watching our daughter and granddaughter thrive, and knowing that we can finally share a space without carrying the weight of old Hunt too. We are too old to waste our remaining years holding on to old wounds. Let them go. Focus on being a good grandfather to Sophie, and build a real foundation with Chloe." Chloe smiled, a soft mist of tears in her eyes as she leaned in to give me a brief, genuine hug. "Thank you for your grace, Admiral. I promise you I will never look at a stranger the same way again." I watched their luxury sedan pull out of the school lot, navigating the winding main roads with a quiet smoothness, before I finally climbed into the driver's seat of my own vehicle. Turning the key, the familiar rattle of the exhaust filled the cabin, a sound that felt like home. As I drove down the coastal highway toward my cottage, the fading sunlight painted the Atlantic in brilliant shades of deep purple and liquid gold. I rolled down the window, letting the sharp, freezing wind fill the car, carrying the pure scent of the sea. For nearly 4 decades, I had chased milestones, promotions, command responsibilities, stars pinned to my shoulders, and the cold, structured metrics of military achievement. Those things were honorable, and they had shaped my mind. But as I looked at the vast horizon of the ocean, I knew they weren't the things that truly mattered. The greatest achievement of my 62 years wasn't becoming an admiral. It was becoming a woman who no longer needed to prove her value to a single soul on this earth. It was the quiet, unbreakable ability to forgive without forgetting, to look at those who had degraded me with a sense of profound pity rather than anger, and to navigate the final chapters of my life with a pure, unshakable sense of internal peace. Your worth never depended on their approval in the first place. And once you realize that, you are finally completely free. The quietude of my main cottage provided the ultimate decompression chamber after the emotional currents of the past month. I sat at my wooden dining table, the morning sun casting long, geometric shadows across a stack of old naval logbooks and a freshly brewed cup of black coffee, looking out the window at the Atlantic. I began to reflect deeply on the mechanics of social perception that had played out at Julian S.'s wedding. In the military, power is institutionalized, structured, and visibly worn on your shoulders. Everyone knows exactly who you are because the system dictates it. But in the civilian world, especially within the hyper-wealthy corporate echelons Julian inhabited, power is an elaborately staged theater of consumption. People like Julian and Chloe spent millions of dollars on clothing, cars, and venues not because they loved art or elegance, but because they desperately needed a physical barrier to separate themselves from the rest of humanity. They used luxury as a metric to determine who deserved basic courtesy and who could be safely ignored. The structural profiling I experienced from the valet attendant, the wedding coordinator, and eventually the bride herself wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural, logical conclusion of a society that values capital over character. When you strip away a person's financial labels, you force them to rely entirely on their intrinsic human value. a reality that terrifies those who have spent their entire lives hiding behind a wall of money. By walking into that country club wearing a $45 dress, I had unintentionally weaponized my own apparent simplicity. I had created a psychological mirror. Julian and Chloe didn't mistreat me because they hated me. They mistreated me because their internal operating system automatically programmed them to view an unbranded, unassuming woman as a tool to validate their own elevated status. They needed me to be poor so that they could feel undeniably rich. Later that afternoon, the phone on my kitchen counter rang, its sharp tone breaking my internal monologue. I picked it up to find General Thomas Vance on the line. His deep, commanding voice immediately filling the room with a sense of familiar military camaraderie. Victoria. Thomas chuckled, the sound rich and warm. I just wanted to check in on my favorite hidden admiral. The corporate intelligence reports from New England are still buzzing about your little deployment to Martha C's Vineyard. You completely turned that ballroom into a theater of operation. I didn't plan for the salute, Thomas, I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face as I leaned against the counter. You completely broke my operational camouflage. With all due respect, Vice Admiral. Some protocols are entirely non-negotiable, Thomas replied, his tone shifting into a serious, respectful cadence. I spent 40 years in the Marine Corps learning how to spot true leadership, and I wasn't about to let a room full of Hing real estate developers treat a legendary naval commander like a forgotten piece of administrative logistics. But more importantly, Julian needed that wake-up call. For decades, that boy has used his balance sheets as a license to treat people like disposable resources. You didn't just expose his ignorance. Victoria, you challenged the entire transactional framework of his life. You showed that room that true authority doesn't require a price tag to be absolute. Our conversation drifted into memories of old deployments, shared logistics operations, and the bittersweet transition from high-stakes military commands to the absolute stillness of civilian retirement. By the time I hung up the phone, the sun was beginning its slow, majestic descent into the western pine forests, painting the sky in deep gradients of violet, crimson, and pale gold. I walked out onto my back porch, wrapping a warm woolen shawl tightly around my shoulders to shield myself from the freezing evening wind. Cynthia and Sophie were walking along the rocky shoreline below, their laughter carrying over the steady, rhythmic crash of the dark gray waves against the coast. Watching my daughter and granddaughter move with such unburdened joy, I realized that the true resolution of this entire drama wasn't the dramatic exposure in the ballroom, nor was it the profound apologies that followed. The true resolution was the restoration of our family's emotional alignment. Julian's willingness to step down from his pedestal of vanity to attend Sophia's school ceremony, to sit beside me without a single ounce of toxic competition, was a victory that no military promotion could ever replicate. It takes an immense amount of internal structural strength for an arrogant man to admit his life S-metric was entirely flawed. At 62, I had learned never to underestimate the human capacity for growth and transformation. Some individuals evolve through quiet introspection, while others require a catastrophic public humiliation to finally shatter their illusions. Julian had needed the foundation of his assumptions to crack so that a real, authentic human being could finally emerge from behind the corporate facade. As the last remnants of daylight vanished below the horizon, leaving behind a brilliant canopy of stars over the Atlantic, a deep, unshakable sense of peace anchored itself within my chest. For nearly 40 years, my life had been an endless pursuit of external validation, earning the next rank, mastering the next strategic deployment, and securing the approval of the Pentagon. Those achievements were honorable, and they had forged my resilience. But they were never the ultimate destination. The greatest victory of my entire journey was becoming a woman who no longer needed a single star on her shoulder, a single asset in her portfolio, or a single word of approval from anyone on this earth to know her exact value. Your worth does not come from what others think of you. It comes entirely from who you are when absolutely nobody is watching. When you finally claim that truth, the weapons of condescension, judgment, and superficial profiling lose their power over you completely. You become entirely untouchable, anchored in an internal sanctuary of grace that no social storm can ever disturb. I took one last deep breath of the freezing salt air, turned toward the warm, glowing lights of my cottage, and walked inside, completely free. As we close the chapter on Victoria's journey, We are forced to look into a mirror and examine how we measure the worth of the people around us. The true tragedy of Julian's life wasn't that he failed to recognize a three-star vice admiral. It was his belief that anyone wearing a $45 dress deserved to be treated with condescension. We live in a world that is heavily intoxicated by the illusion of status, currency, and exterior packaging. We are constantly conditioned to respect the labels a person wears, long before we respect the soul inside them. But as Victoria so gracefully proved, a storm treats a billionaire-esque yacht exactly the same way it treats a humble fisherman-esque boat. True authority and human dignity are built from an internal anchor of character, integrity, and resilience, things that cannot be bought, sold, or bartered in a real estate portfolio. If you have ever felt invisible, underestimated, or judged by your circumstances, let this story be your emotional sanctuary. Their inability to see your light does not mean your light has stopped shining. It simply means they are blind to anything that doesn't carry a price tag. The ultimate victory over those who have wronged you is never public humiliation or bitter revenge. The ultimate victory is achieving a state of profound inner peace where you no longer require their validation to know that you matter. Furthermore, let this stand as an urgent warning to our community. The moment we look down on another human being based on their socioeconomic status, we are actively eroding our own humanity. Treat every individual, from the valet parking the cars to the leaders commanding nations, with the radical, unconditional respect that is a fundamental human right. Please remember that this entire piece of content was meticulously researched, crafted, and manually edited by our dedicated team. We pour our hearts into every single line of this script to ensure we deliver profound meaning, deep healing, and transformative life lessons directly to your soul. Thank you for anchoring your valuable time with us today. Keep your canvas high, protect your peace, and we will see you in our next journey.